The following is an encore presentation of stories from the Dooralong Transformation Centre.
I have Joe in the studio with me. We've already had a little chat this morning. Joe's from Dooralong Transformation Centre, and Joe has an accent.
I do, yes. I'm one of the... Well, I'm not a whinging pom, but I was born in England. But funny enough, I never felt English. My father was Dutch, and I lived there till I was 23, yeah.
In England?
I did, yes.
Whereabouts in England?
I was born in Bromley, southeast London, in Kent. And at that time, that was real suburbia. Now it's been swallowed up into the metropolis of London, but we were close to the Kent farm belts and the apple farm. So it was
tell us a little bit about your younger life in London.
Oh, there's really not much to tell you. It was suburban boredom. My parents came from abject poverty, and my mother was from a family of 9, and my father was an only son, but both from very poor backgrounds. But they had the gift of intelligence, and my mother became a headmistress, and my father CEO of one of the largest advertising firms in England. So it was a very traditional English life where you went to school, you went home, you went to sleep, you got up in suburbia, incredibly boring. And my parents came from that generation. They were also people of the war, so they'd been evacuated. And so really their generation, you know, it's so different today as a young person, but back then owning your own home and getting wealthy was, you know, the mode of operation, because that was safety and security.
Yeah. And
my parents did that extremely effectively, but like many parents of that generation, emotionally it was a different matter.
Yeah.
And my father was an atheist, my mother a Protestant, and they sent me to an Irish Catholic convent for my upbringing, who didn't like me because I was Protestant. So, yeah, it was a very convoluted experience.
Wow.
Yeah.
And that whole Catholic Protestant, it was an issue over there that we don't see in Australia.
Absolutely.
It's something that you obviously really got to experience.
Yeah, it's, you know, England is not only a very classist system, so coming from poverty you're looked down on, but also religiously, yeah, particularly from the Irish contingent, you know, whether you're Protestant or Catholic, it's, holds a great weight, yeah.
Yeah, wow. Now, of course, you ended up at Dooralong.
I did.
Because of alcohol.
That's correct.
Issues. Tell us a little bit about when you first experienced alcohol, or how you got to know about alcohol. When did it creep into your life?
When did it creep in? My very first experience, my drink was actually laced. I was out with my parents at a family function, and the other kids thought it would be funny. And what's interesting about that is I don't remember it all, but apparently I threw up in the car on the way home. And looking back, I think I went into immediate blackout. I had an instant allergic reaction to it. So I wasn't excited about it. I wasn't looking for it. But then the next time...
At what age?
That was probably 16. And then later that year, something had been woken up, and I stole a bottle of red wine from my father and took it to school. And I and my great friend Jane Begley drank it in the lunch hour. Well, Jane was rather a large girl and had a good appetite, so she was gurgling it down. So to keep up with her, I did the same. And I'll never forget, we had French double biology in the afternoon. We were together in French, and I started feeling really odd. And then we separated for biology. And she was fine, but I nearly passed out and threw a bucket of red wine up all over one of the nuns.
Oh, no.
And was dragged off to the doctor, and all sorts of, you know, repercussions from that. But you'd think that would teach me, you know, my first 2 advents into it. But as I said earlier, on that second time, the red wine, my distinct feeling when I drank it was of a rush of power, and the sentence, "This is what normal people must feel like." So I knew I had found an elixir. I knew that I had found something that changed my perception of myself, although I wouldn't have been able to verbalize that then, and changed how I felt as a member of society. And that was a really strong pull for me, because I was shy, I was very uneasy throughout all my life. I didn't feel I belonged, and I didn't know how to cope with life. I had no life skills. But give me one drink, and I was the life of the party.
It's interesting you say a feeling of power. And at the same time, you literally got sick in class. to have that feeling of power, and you must have been in a bit of a state. That sort of doesn't sound right. I guess you would have been swaying a little bit at the time?
Oh, yes. But that wasn't the original effect, you see. When I had it in the grounds of the school during the lunchtime, I felt powerful for about half an hour.
Right.
Then I began to feel really sick. But that power was so seductive, to me it was worth the sickness. And that is a facet of addiction in my experience and in others, that rush, that sense of belonging, that sense of I can cope with life is worth the trauma that comes later.
Wow. See, I guess from my point of view, I've not been through that. And from the outside looking in, we sort of go, wow, how could you possibly get that feeling if that was the result? But you're not alone. There's many people in the same situation. And we're in the studio with Jo this morning. Jo, who's down here from Dooralong Transformation Centre. She's told us a bit about her growing up years, up to the age of 16 in a, did you call it a convent or just a Catholic school?
It was a Catholic convent, yes.
Catholic convent. And getting to the point of being quite drunk at school one day on red wine. And I guess, Jo, you told us that you felt an attraction to alcohol because of that feeling of power. Now, obviously, you're well educated. What happened after that?
After that, I would drink at events, so teenage parties. I certainly wasn't a daily drinker, but I was always the one at the party that would be embarrassed and humiliated. I'd be the one with mascara running down my face at the end of the night. I'd be the one brought home by somebody's mother. I'd be the one who was sick yet again. And was a problem case, you know. I mean, people were embarrassed by me. I was humiliated. But it was restricted to those weekend settings. And I managed to get through school. I left the convent. I said that it was far too restrictive for me, and I went to a co-ed college, and that was a very good move for me. And I did my A-levels, which is the English system of high school, in psychology, theatre and literature. And then life really took a turn for the worse because I caught the magic bus to Greece. And this is what you did in England at that time. It was £50, and you got a return trip to Athens on a bus that took 3 days going down through Yugoslavia, as it was called then.
So this was, you finished your HSC,
yep.
And that's your schoolies.
It's like your schoolies.
Treat.
Yeah, it's your treat. Only that's where my alcoholism just went ballistic, and I went with Jane, my friend, and we ended up on Paros, an island, because you go to Athens and catch the ferry, and hooked up with a very unsavoury man over there who had massive addiction problems and had gone there to detox but was not detoxing. And I literally went from a suburban, vaguely responsible life, but certainly did well in my schooling and, you know, was functioning, to complete chaos. And was drunk as a skunk, hanging with the wrong crowd. And that really began my...
For how long?
Well, I had a place at university, so I was back within a year, but during that year my parents threw me out of the home because of who I'd ended up with. Chose not to pay for university unless I wasn't with those people, so I then entered lying and told them I wasn't, even though I was. And life became very, very messy. I had really gone through a door into darkness, and everything that's negative in this world was claiming me. And I became a daily drinker very quickly. I went to university, but I can't say I went there. I gave in the papers I had to give in, but I never read a book. And got a job in a pub, as you do. So, and that pub happened to be run by the English mafia. So I went out of the frying pan into the fire, and I was told very clearly, if you work in this pub, you don't go to other pubs, they're rivals. And I saw gunfights, knifings, beatings. These were, very, very dangerous people.
So I guess the alcoholism led you into a very dangerous place.
Absolutely, and I used to think that I was living life. The way I qualified it in my mind was, this is real life, I'm on the edge, you know. And I didn't I thought it was excitement, but actually I was living in terror. And that's often something we do in addiction. We don't know our emotional state, so we get very confused. And because I was so numb from the drink, and this is what also happens, it takes extreme situations to feel alive, because inside I was dead.
Wow.
So by being in death-defying situations externally, I felt alive. And secondly, the madness in my own mind by then was so intense. If I could equal it with mad exterior situations, I felt sane.
Wow.
Because otherwise, to be mentally insane and be working a 9 to 5 and have a normal life, I would have to recognize my insanity.
Yeah.
But by putting myself in extreme situations, I could pretend I was still functioning normally.
And as what they call a functioning alcoholic, at that stage, did you realise that you had a drinking problem?
That was the bizarre denial of drinking. I didn't. As I say, I came from an alcoholic home. But what we do in alcoholism is we surround ourselves with people that either drink the same or more, so that we can point the finger. Well, they're worse than I am, even though I was a daily abject drunk. Well, I'm not the man on the park bench.
Wow.
That you can always find somebody worse than yourself and
So that
continue in your
means
denial.
You don't have a problem.
That's
if
it.
there's someone worse than you.
That's it.
Right. Okay.
We've got Jo in the studio from Dooralong Transformation Centre, and Jo's been telling us a little bit about her life, her life, and I guess the walk into alcoholism.
Mm-hmm.
It started with that first drink back when she was 16 to feeling powerful at her Catholic high school, and after stealing a bottle of red wine and then getting quite sick at school, and then that led into alcoholism. You got up to the point where you were at a pub, you're working at a pub, there's violence, all sorts of crazy things happening around you, and you're thinking, this is normal.
Yep. That's the root of alcoholism, I'm afraid. It's not necessarily that everybody ends up in a mafia pub, but certainly the demoralisation and degradation of the path of an alcoholic is that what is inhuman and abnormal becomes normal to the person experiencing it, because that's the only way you can cope. If you really, really looked at your life at that point, it would be such a shock, you wouldn't be able to cope with it. So.
And where did you go from the pub?
Well, I literally had to escape England. I already didn't particularly like England that much, but...
Why did you want to escape?
Because of the violence and the people I was involved in.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't commit anything, but I knew a lot.
Mm.
And it wasn't very safe for me, and it was one of those situations, if you're in it, you're in it. So I ended up marrying somebody that wasn't in it, but was thought of as more violent than the people in it. So it was progressively, as a female alcoholic, one of the issues is protection. And my boyfriends were becoming more and more violent because I needed a more violent one to beat off the one before. So it's a horrendous cycle of self-destruction and destruction from others. So I ended up with this particular gentleman that they were afraid of, and we decided to move to the west of Ireland to remove ourselves from that environment. My core being hated it, but I was trapped in its cycle. And so we moved to the west of Ireland to a little fishing village called Dingle, which is the most westerly point in Ireland, very beautiful but very remote. And I ended up running a restaurant and craft shop there for about 13 years. And really in Ireland there's the priest or the pub, and my alcoholism just became horrendous there. If it was bad before, then it was just constant, until I ended up on the side of the road at 29.
And the side of the road at 29, where were you?
In Dingle. Yep, still in that fishing village, and the embarrassment there was that it was so small and remote that everybody knew you and everybody saw everything, so there was no hiding from it.
And you got picked up by the ambulance?
Yep, picked up by the ambulance, taken to Tralee, which was the nearest town hospital, and I spoke this morning about how I think that was my first spiritual experience. I awoke to find a psychiatrist over my bed offering me detox, and remember looking at his face and thinking, what's the point? I hate living. I just don't want to live. and whatever you're offering me is not going to give me joy for life. So unless I find that, I'm leaving this planet. And I remember bargaining with God. It was my first conversation with God, and you're not supposed to do this, but I said to God, I give you 1 year, and if I'm not happier in 1 year, I won't drink again, but I will take my own life.
Wow. And where did that lead you?
I did a lot of dog walking that year, I can tell you, on the beach with my 2 Cocker Spaniels. But within that year, I shut the restaurant because I could not, be serving alcohol 12 hours a day and keep my sanity. And that began a process of movement. And I also, at that time, I'd begun going to AA. And I understood that I had to develop a relationship with the higher power, but I didn't know what that meant. So I went to the bookshop, as you do, being an academic. And I went to Waterstones in Cork, and I thought, I'm going to find a book on God. And so I was looking at all these East-West philosophies, and this book fell forward off the shelf and hit me in the foot. And it was red and gold, and I thought, oh, I don't know what that is, but it's really pretty. I'll put it in my bag with all my other books. And I got home, and of course that was the only book I pulled out, and I read 3 pages of it and said, I have to meet this man, I don't care where he is. And it was the Tibetan Book of Living and Dying, written by Sogyal Rinpoche, who's a renowned Buddhist master. And so I thought, okay, I've got to meet this man. I guess I'm off to Tibet, I don't know how I'll do it. And I looked up in the back of the book where he had spiritual centres, and he only had one at that time. He'd had to leave Tibet due to the uprising. He was studying theology at Cambridge, and he had one spiritual retreat centre, which was 2 hours down the road in the west of Ireland.
Wow. And that led you on a path of seeking enlightenment.
A profound path, of 17 years, during which time I remained completely sober. I went to AA wherever I travelled. And I spent that 17 years studying under Sogyal Rinpoche. Concurrently, I studied for 10 years with a Celtic mystic who was trained by Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, who taught conscious living, conscious dying in the West, and developed the hospice movement. And also 10 years in and out of Peru with Alberto Villoldo, who's a master shaman.
Wow. So some interesting spiritual moments there, I'm sure.
Yeah.
You said before, or you mentioned somebody called you the runaway Buddhist. Is that what it was?
Yes, a bit like the Runaway Bride. If you've seen that film, every time she gets to the altar, she's off.
Yeah.
And that was my master who coined that phrase for me. We'd always had a really unique relationship. And I don't mean anything intimate by that, but intimate in the heart. And my longing, as is for most people with a spiritual master, and I think particularly as a Westerner, I wanted 3 things. I wanted to be shown the way, I wanted a path, I wanted a destiny, and I wanted a spiritual master. And perhaps in a little while we'll talk about that's because primarily I mistook a spiritual path because I had an addiction to certainty. I wanted to be sure of my way to God. But I didn't know that at the time. And so I was in relationship and studying and practicing and living in monasteries for all this time. And finally the moment came, and Rinpoche asked me twice to step up, basically. And I would have been in a position as his right-hand woman, which meant travelling with him, teaching with him, having the lineage passed on to me. It's the highest accolade you can have in that system, really. And I said no and ran away. And always in the monastery, everybody would be prostrating to him and doing their classes, and I'd be down in town having a coffee and, unfindable, and hence the nickname Runaway Buddhist. And then finally, he didn't think it would be me anymore because I was just never following his orders, shall we say. And so he sent 12 names to the Dalai Lama for divination on who should have this particular role, and it came back me. And so the 3rd time I went back, he actually found me in Colorado, where I was in university, in a Buddhist university, doing a master's in psychology, and said, come back to the monastery, and basically asked me to promise that I would never leave again, that I didn't understand that this was my destiny, to help bring the Dharma to the West, and Dharma in Buddhism means truth. And there it was. There was my spiritual package. The master I loved, the destiny I had wanted, the recognition I had wanted, and the path, all in a package.
We've got Jo in the studio from Dooralong Transformation Centre. Jo's actually originally from England, and she's moved to Ireland. She's been all over the place,
Yep.
and her story has I guess, led her to a moment in time where her name, one of 12, was sent to the Dalai Lama for divination. And what happened, Jo?
What happened? As Rinpoche was saying that to me, waiting for me to promise, I was not biblically knowledgeable back then. I'm hardly biblically knowledgeable now, frankly. But something in me knew not to make a promise that I couldn't keep to a spiritual being. And I'm interested now to read in the Bible, never vow. Do not make vows. And the words would not come out of my mouth. Here was everything I had longed for, everything I'd worked for, everything many people I
17
speak
years.
to. Yeah, many people I speak to long for exactly that, a spiritual destiny, a teacher and a path. And I didn't promise, and I said I'll give it a try. And I don't think he was very happy, but that was the best I could utter at that time. And being close to a spiritual master of that caliber, you actually feel naked. They can see into you and read your thought processes. It's very intimate experience. So in my own mind I said, okay, do not leave for a month. Something's wrong with me that I can't commit to this. Is it commitment? Is it that people would say to me, it's your ego, you just can't surrender? And my response was, my ego would love this. I'd be flown first class, I'm with a high master, so people are getting out the way for me. It was kind of sickening. That material spirituality, as I would call it. And this particular day, Rinpoche sent me up to a room in the temple. It's the biggest temple in France. It's called L'Erabling. And in this particular room, everything that's been brought out of Tibet, that's the Dalai Lama's, so all the little artifacts and gold images and everything, very powerful room, sent me there to pray. And I just collapsed on the floor. And I was sobbing, and I was in fetal position. And I called out to God. I didn't know who else was left. I felt I was in the highest spiritual caliber of training there was, but I couldn't commit to it. And I said, I'm in torture. I'm in absolute torture. It wasn't a fun experience for me at all. And I said, here I am being offered what I thought I longed for. And everything in my gut is telling me no. Everything in a physical sense layer is saying no, and I don't understand this process. And there was nothing to hold on to, nothing to grip in my being, in my psyche, in my mind that could help me through it. And I prayed and I sobbed, and then felt a little calmer and went down for a teaching. And Rinpoche came in, and I was given this image. And in Buddhism it's very hierarchical. People think it isn't, but it is. And Rinpoche was ascending to his golden throne, and one of the Western nuns in full nun regalia crawled forward on her hands and knees to take off his shoes for him to ascend the throne. Now, I have to remark here that in Buddhism, touching the master's feet is considered a high regard, because that's where their energy is said to reside, the Shakti, as they would say in the Indian traditions, the spiritual energy of the master. So I knew that as a thought process, but this image of this woman crawling forward on her hands and knees to take the shoes off a man, and a man nonetheless who then ascended the throne and everybody began to prostrate to, which is a form of bowing where you go flat on the floor. I actually felt my stomach completely turn, and almost like a lock opening, and it was such a visual expression of everything that I cannot stand in man-made spirituality. I couldn't bear it. I literally had a full body, wanted to vomit, and the phrase that came to my head is, this is not God. God alone is God. And not being a Christian and not, having trained in Buddhism for 17 years, I sort of made note of that, but it was full on. And I left the next day. But when I left, I went to stay with friends in the south of France, and I went into the biggest spiritual breakdown I've ever experienced in my life.
Wow, that is amazing. That's, 17 years. It's obviously something that I mean, the breakdown, I can imagine 17 years and you'd be saying to yourself, what have I just done in those 17 years? It's led me to this position of, I guess, non-understanding.
Took a lot of courage to do that.
It didn't feel like courage at the time. People have said that, but it felt as though I had lost. I had lost the battle for goodness. I had lost the battle for helping people. I had lost my own battle. That was the experience. Looking back, yes, courage. At the time, no.
Of course, things changed. We're in the studio with Jo this morning. Jo from Dooralong Transformation Centre has taken us on a little journey through her life. We've just been at a Buddhist monastery for 17 years, and Jo has just left the monastery. Jo, what happened next?
It didn't go well. I left the monastery and, as I said, went to a house of friends in the south of France and went into complete spiritual breakdown, which manifested as lying in bed with darkness coming at me, with being unable to eat or sleep, and a profound loss of identity, I think, looking back, because this was something I'd striven for 17 years, that I had put all my eggs in one basket, if you like, from an English saying, and lived and breathed. And looking back, it was the power source that I lived from, the Buddhist teachings. I have absolutely no regrets. They opened me to a world of perceptual reality, a world of spirituality, some wonderful, wonderful teachings, and a wonderful, wonderful master whom I still hold in high regard. But losing all of that, I just had nowhere to turn. How do you go from that to working a 9-to-5 job? How do you go from that to... It was so out of field. The whole 17 years was basically a mystical path to trying to be a functioning normal member of society. And the decision I made was to go to the only Buddhist university in the West, which is in Boulder, Colorado, to study a master's in Buddhist psychology and transpersonal psychology. The university is called Naropa. Actually, let me backtrack. I had started there. Sorry, I missed a part of... I had started there before that third offer. So just before that third offer, my blood father had also died of alcoholism. And so I had come back to Europe to deal with his death, gone on to Rinpoche's, taken a semester out of school thinking I'd stay at Rinpoche's, and then made the decision to go back to finish off my university degree, because I thought, well, if I do Buddhist psychology, at least I can function, at least I can offer something to society. I went back to Boulder in Colorado, and I met the Australian man that I would come to Australia with, Jeff. And I was living at his house, and I was in and out of depression. This was the first time in my life I had to go on antidepressants. I never had in my first recovery. My world was falling apart. My parents had died. It felt like the energy had just drained out of my life, but I was going through the motions. And I was lying upstairs in his house one day in a sort of study we had, and I again was in spiritual torment. I felt all during this time completely bereft. I felt suicidal again. I felt I'd given up my life's purpose, and that I had no reason to live, basically. And I was calling out to a God I didn't know and a God I didn't understand. It was just a word I'd heard of. And I said, God, if you're there, you need to give me a sign, because I'm going to opt out of life if you don't. And the window blew open with a loud smash, and this huge wind came through the room, and it blew Rinpoche's photo off the desk and smashed it on the floor.
Wow.
And even I got that side. I may be stubborn, but even I got that one.
No.
That means no. And so I was like, oh, maybe there is a God. That was really my first experience of being answered. And my partner called up the stairs and he said, come on, let's go for a drive in the Colorado mountains, and you're depressed, we need to get you out of the house. And I didn't tell him this had happened, and I was like, okay. Well, being somebody that wants more than they should have. On the after having that experience, on the whole drive up to the mountains, I was saying to God, well, that's fine, great, so you're real. Whoopee-I-yay. Well, if you're real, I want to know what deity I should be working with, because Buddhism really relies on working with deities. So I was still in that mental formation, thinking, well, great, God's God, but what about me? Who do I work with? I mean, unbelievable when I look back. I just got the phone line to God himself, and I'm saying, well, who should I work with? But that was me. So I'm asking all the way up, I'm praying this, and we get to a spot, and Jeff says, you love water, you go off, I'll just sit here. And I could hear water in the distance, and I had to scrabble through this undergrowth and bushes because I was determined to get to this stream. It was somewhere we'd never been, and I'm still holding this prayer, and I look up and I see this flash of gold on a tree, and I thought, that's bizarre. What is gold doing in the middle of the Colorado Rockies? It doesn't make sense. And I go over to it, and there's a gold plaque on this tree, golden colour, and it says, Jesus is my Lord and Master, to him I turn for everything. And there's a quote from Job.
That's incredible.
Subtle hint.
A little subtle hint. So I'm just...
Wow.
Okay. And I still think it's so bizarre. And eventually I looked around and I found that there was a plaque on the floor, and before it had been overgrown, it was obviously somebody's favourite place to go, and they were buried there. Their ashes were buried there, and that must have been their favourite quote. But if you know anything about Colorado, the Rockies are a huge place, and to ask that question and be specifically led to that tree, I cannot deny.
What an answer to prayer. Fantastic. We've got Jo in the studio with us from Dooralong Transformation Centre. What an interesting life. Jo was born in England. She spent some time in England, then Ireland, then off to the...
America, France,
all over the place. Yeah, all over the place on a search for spiritual enlightenment. Now that was after her trip into alcoholism, and then all of a sudden a 17-year sabbatica whilst on the search for enlightenment, and then the end of that came a mass depression. What did you call it?
I don't remember.
Complete spiritual breakdown.
Spiritual breakdown,
yeah.
That was it. And then crying out to God.
Mm-hmm.
And God actually leading you to a few places.
Mm-hmm.
Interesting. Now we know that was the God of the Bible.
Yes.
Because you literally walked up to a tree in a giant forest. In fact, it's more than a giant forest. It's probably as big as some countries.
Mm-hmm.
And on that tree was written...
Jesus is my Lord and Master. I turn to him for everything, and a quote from Job.
And that was after asking God to show you who you were meant to follow.
Mm.
That's fantastic.
So I ignored it.
You ignored it.
Okay.
As you do.
As
Yes.
you do.
Yes. And where did that lead you, Jo?
To Job.
Yep.
Yeah. To living Job, to living the book of Job. And I say I ignore it a bit flippantly. I mean, I was profoundly struck, and but I could not let go of the Buddhism. And I look back, and what I see is, I was given such a structure and form in Buddhism, whereas God is such a mystery, so open. And that's the quality I now delight in with him. But it brought up terror in me. I didn't know. There's two things that I feel about God. One I love and one I dislike. And they're both the same, and that's he's completely unmanipulatable. So I have profound respect for him for that, and as a human being it irks me, because I cannot... God is Teflon, he's non-stick. Nothing I try to attach to him or get from him works at all. He's the master snow slope, if you like, So yeah, it was a process of letting go what I had invested so much time in, and I tried to go back to Buddhist monasteries, but I would end up reading the Christian mystics, the Gnostics, Therese d'Avila, John of God. So it was beginning, but I was uncomfortable with it, and I was uncomfortable calling myself a Christian. I was uncomfortable. I don't know why. I think a lot of it had to do with the dogmatism of religion and the church, which I saw as corrupt and, God forbid, but the paedophilia and the thou shalt not, and not seeing people living the expression of Christian faith that I expected. So I ended up thinking, oh well, I went to a local Anglican church, and that was bizarre. I loved the ritualism, but it was, not my concept of what Christianity should be. So I basically threw it all aside, and I said, okay, I'm just going to be normal. That word keeps coming up. I'm going to work at this drug and alcohol centre called the Buttery. I'm going to stay with Jeff. I'm going to cook dinner at night. I'm going to go to AA meetings, and that's what I'm doing. I'm just going to give up this whole quest, this whole seeking.
So AA meetings, were you drinking again at this stage?
No, this was on my entry to Australia, and I wasn't drinking. And to sum it all up fairly quickly, I basically began to live out of integrity. In fact, I'd been living out of integrity since I left Rinpoche. I was still searching, but I was trying to cobble together an example of a life that appeared normal and functioned and was socially acceptable, because I was inherently lost. I was lost at my core and would not receive God even though he'd offered himself.
So how did you end up back in alcoholism?
Well, from there it's pretty easy slope. I became so lost and dissatisfied and broken at my core that I turned back to an old friend that I knew would fix it in one drink. The power of alcohol is that it's certain, that's for sure, and that by taking that glass I could completely ignore and anesthetize the living hell I was experiencing. So I kind of made a conscious choice, I could have chosen that point to surrender fully to God, but I'm stubborn for whatever reason, and I chose unconsciousness and lived out 5 years of Job. I lost everything. I lost the house, I lost the partner, I lost the job, I lost my sanity, I lost my dignity. I basically spent it was 7 years in all, but I basically spent the last 5 years in psychiatric wards, rehabs, hospitals, and thoroughly humiliating and embarrassing myself and anybody else around me, and in and out of suicidal attempts.
Wow, and I guess that was the low point, when you get to that point of wanting to take your own life.
Yeah, absolutely.
So why Dooralong? How did you end up at Dooralong?
It was a God intervention, I believe. I'd been to many rehabs that just were not, I was not experiencing in AA and in the 12 steps. They say we need a power greater than ourselves to restore us to sanity and to life. And I have found that to be absolutely true. Addiction is such a deadly foe, such a primary use of darkness, that you have got to have something stronger than darkness itself to overcome it. And I, of myself, am not capable of that. That's why psychology doesn't work for addiction. That's why anything man-made will not work. And I knew that, but I wasn't willing to surrender. And I went to a grace seminar in Lismore, which was a weekend of how to actually, unbeknownst to me, move from darkness to light, that Craig is a master at speaking and living. And so
how did you get to that? Why did you choose to go to that?
Well, I had been to one Salvation Army rehab before called Fairhaven, which is nothing like Dooralong, and I didn't stay that long, but I met the Salvation Army through that. And I was really impressed with their rolled up sleeves, hands on, really walking a Christian life. It didn't fulfill me because I didn't experience a power of the living Christ in them, the power of the Holy Spirit in them, but I saw very good people, very loving people. So I was attracted, and I went to the Lismore Corps near where I live, and they were having this weekend, so I went along, and I was so happy. I had finally found what I had lost years back. Was, as Craig and Greg spoke, I experienced the power of the Holy Spirit. I experienced Christ. I experienced God in the room. I experienced liberation from my state of being.
And this is 6 years after you prayed to God, Lord, show me the truth. Yeah. The window blows open and smashes. Your spiritual master at that time, his photo blows down and smashes. Then you pray again to God, Lord, show me who I have to follow. You end up out in the middle of a forest and find this written on a tree, the scripture on a tree, and it takes 6 years.
I'm a slow learner. What can I say?
Wow.
But I don't think that 6 years is necessary for other people. I hope if I share something today, it's that you don't have to go through Job, the experience of Job. You know, I did, because I'm incredibly stubborn. And I was incredibly fearful. And, you know, I believe that darkness and the principalities of darkness work most closely at your spiritual experience. Because if they can come in there, they can come in to all facets of your life. And I was terrified. I was terrified of surrender. I was terrified of letting go. I've shared it here with you over coffee, and I believe most people in the West have a primary addiction, and that's the addiction to certainty. We want a spiritual path that gives us certainty. That is not what God offers. That is the beauty of God.
Do you think it intriguing that your Buddhist spiritual master gave you the nickname the runaway Buddhist? and look what's happened.
Yeah.
Wow, incredible. Yeah. And at the same time, he was trying to stop you from, I guess, your destiny playing out. Interesting. Now we're in the studio with Jo from Dooralong Transformation Centre, and Jo has really given us a tale of her life. Her life, which I can see the name Runaway Buddhist. It's written all over her. Jo is now at a point where she's just attended a seminar up in the Northern Rivers area.
Lismore. In
Lismore. And what happens after that, Jo?
So when I was at that seminar, I had a profound experience, and in my mind I said to myself, well, it won't happen, but if ever I have to go to rehab again, I'm going to go where this man is, because Craig explained that he ran a rehab centre.
And of course Craig's from Dooralong.
Craig is the manager at Dooralong, that's correct. And I was so profoundly moved by that weekend, and you know, I really want to explain that Craig has many wonderful qualities as a human being, but what attracted me to him, and therefore Dooralong, was that I got a taste of a man who his ability to surrender and allow the Holy Spirit and divinity and God and Christ to flow through him is exceptional. And that's what attracted me. I saw what I wanted to become. I saw the level I wanted to surrender at. And it was like a beacon of light to me. And I hadn't experienced that in the Salvation Army before. I'm sure there's others. For me personally, I hadn't experienced it. So the weekend I was actually supposed to take soldiership, because I went through the soldiership training in the Salvation Army. I got drunk as a skunk and didn't make it to the soldiership, went on a terrible experience that we don't have time for, and ended up at Dooralong. And, you know, I really just want to spend this end time sharing my experience at Dooralong, which has been absolutely magnificent. I've only been there 9 weeks, and I have to say I don't look, think or feel as the shivering wreck, literally, that turned up there. People said I looked like a rabbit in the headlights. I was in shock. I was terrified. I spent the first day bawling and telling them I had to leave. You know, this wasn't for me, which was just all the sickness coming out of me. And I have never been in a place in my life that holds with such love and gentleness and care. And somebody here this morning shared, you know, living there is like God saying to you, you're worth it, because the ground's magnificent. The setting is beautiful, but it would be nothing without the workers and the program. And it's really cutting edge. I've worked in the field. I've been in many rehabs. Dooralong is exceptionally different. In fact, they say there, we're not a rehab. We are a centre of transformation. We are a centre where Christ transforms lives to transform other lives. And our process there is a process of movement from the realm of darkness and all that that pertains to the realm of light, and recognizing and living the truth that I'm a child of God. I'm loved by God. I can approach his throne confidently. I inherit the kingdom of God through the decision to seek repentance and turn to Christ for mercy. You know, and that lived experience in a moment-to-moment choice is a million miles away from my addiction, and it's supported there, encouraged and held. And I don't know anywhere else in a rehab where you get that.
Wow. Well, the runaway Buddhist, truly transformed by Christ. Now, it's been a pleasure having you here this morning,
Jo. It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Your story is awesome, and I'm sure there's a lot of people that have shared it or will agree with me there. and there's probably people who, have learnt a lot from that as well. So thank you so much for coming in this morning.
You're welcome. And if anybody's struggling, please pick up the phone and call Dooralong and get yourself on the waiting list, because you can have a transformed life like me and many others.
That's sensational. Thank you so much, Joe.
You've been listening to an encore presentation of the Dooralong stories, which can be heard live every Wednesday at 10 a.m. and repeated at 8 p.m. Sunday and 1 a.m. Wednesday, right here on 94.9 rema.cc.